Lee's back there. I quoted you last week saying I better hurry up or you won't be alive for Revelation. And so actually, in terms of the flow of the film, the last 6 weeks, I calculated we've covered what in a movie would have been about 30 seconds. So we're really screaming along. And today I'm covering the next 3 seconds of the film. So hang in there, okay? Anyway, and we're in the middle of this unfolding story, right almost in the middle of the life of Christ, and we're at this point in the story where we're actually slowing down and exploring what Christ teaches here, where the narrative sort of is coming to a bit of a halt. But this is the Sermon on the Mount. It's the most classic and probably famous discourse that Jesus ever gave, and every little piece of it is so significant that we're stopping. We're sort of camping out there a little bit. The text this morning is really one verse, Matthew 5:9, but I'm going to go back again, and just so we continually immerse our minds in what Christ is teaching here, read through, and I'm going to invite you to fill in a couple of blanks. I made it a little easier this week, but again, to stir your memory. But why don't you read with me? Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the..." That's pathetic, guys. I mean, seriously. You know, it's like, all right. "Blessed are the..." Great. "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who..." "For they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." And then today's text, and it's actually misnumbered on this slide, it's actually verse 9. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." Okay, quickly again, remember the setting. We're up in Galilee. We're on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is up on a small hill. He's called first of all, he's actually called the disciples, the 12, to become apostles. But now, out of the crowd, the disciples, those that are serious about following him, have come up to him on this hillside, and he's begun to teach them. And he teaches them this incredible discourse about what it means to be a person that follows him and lives a kingdom lifestyle, and virtually completely almost counterintuitive to everything that his audience was anticipating. Up till now, we've looked at 6 attributes of what I would say is a person, the kind of person Christ is looking for, but really the kind of person Christ is trying to turn us into. Because when you look at what he teaches on the Sermon on the Mount, I really think that part of what our response should be to it is, man, I'm so far short of that. And that it's a challenge to us. It can almost seem a discouragement because you can read these characteristics and say, it's impossible. I'm never going to be like that. And yet, the good news is that when you hit the point of impossibility, that's really when God's power kicks in, to be honest with you. And he wants to transform our lives so that we look like this. Well, what does it look like? Well, he's looking for people that are desperate in their understanding of their need for God, poor in spirit. He's looking for men and women whose response to that is genuine remorse or repentance. Blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. Out of that, he's looking for people that are willing to submit to his lordship. Blessed are the meek, where we take all that we are, all of our strengths, all of our weaknesses, our ego, and place it under the lordship of Christ. And then out of that, there should be this stirring within us, this new passion, and the passion becomes to be the man or woman that God's created us to be. So blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Recognizing that we bring nothing to the party and that we're desperately in need of God and that he has responded to us in Christ in grace and mercy, we should then be people that extend grace and mercy to others. Blessed are the merciful, And then finally last week, that we are in this process then as Christ comes to live within us and his Spirit comes to dwell within us, where there's this transformation going on to change us. And the primary thing that God's trying to change in our life is our hearts. And so blessed are the pure in heart. And again, we looked at it from the standpoint that this process, and it might be better translated, blessed are the purified in heart, those that are in process of this transformation. By the way, if you step back and look at those characteristics and those that are to come in this introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, you'll notice that what Jesus lays out for them and for us is that the spiritual life has three directions. I think this is how I think about this. That an authentic spiritual life has obviously an upward dimension. And so some of these characteristics primarily have to do with our relationship with God. So for instance, blessed are the meek. That in our relationship with God, we're going to submit to him, that we're going to place our lives under his lordship, and that sort of is this upward direction. But there's also an inward direction of the spiritual life, and that is, again, what is God doing internally in our lives to transform us? So pure in heart is a good example of that God is working to change our hearts and to change who we are from the inside out. And then the third direction of the spiritual life is outward. And we're going to see a lot of this in the Sermon on the Mount, that being in the right relationship with God and him working in our life should then create or be manifested in outward actions toward others. So merciful was a good illustration of that. But today we're going to look at this characteristic that really has to do with what is it that God is trying to do through us, individually, corporately, I'd say even universally, as the Church of Christ in the world today. And I hope to demonstrate to you that as Jesus now, and you see him, he speaks these words, blessed are the peacemakers, that when we understand what he's talking about, I think it should have an impact on what we do when we leave the building. Because the real ministry of the church never takes place, well, I shouldn't say that. It's primarily not what takes place in the building. It's what takes place when we leave the building for the next 6 days of the week. And the concept that I hope you get a hold of today is that you and I have been called to be peacemakers. Well, what's a peacemaker? Well, to begin with, you have to understand the word peace, I think would be a good starting point. When we think of peace, when we think of the word peace, or I would bet, even when we think of the idea of what's a peacemaker, we tend to think about peace being the end of hostility. So again, we look for peace in the Middle East because there's hostility there. We're hoping for peace in Syria because of all that's going on there. Around the world, we see many situations, and probably even in our own lives, relationships that maybe are not what they're supposed to be. Maybe there's hostility, and we tend to think of peace as this concept of an end of hostility. Another way that we think of it, and by the way, that is contained in the Greek word that appears here, eirene, and the other idea is we might think about sort of a peaceful frame of mind, that that if you're at peace, you're in harmony with yourself and sort of in a state of being at rest, and you're in a good place. And sometimes also, because the Scripture uses this word can have to do with peace with God. That in a sense, when we're apart and our relationship with God is not right, there is sort of this hostility, and the message of reconciliation is really a message of entering into this relationship of peace with God. Now, when we think of peace, or a peacemaker in those terms, maybe the image that comes to your mind is something like this, where international hostilities are brought to the table and peace, at least temporarily, is achieved. I found this picture, and I pulled it up because another concept of peace that I think many of us think of is that peacemakers oftentimes, if their work is done on a global scale, oftentimes they receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And both Rabin and Arafat in 1993, because of the work done to try and create peace in the Middle East, and of course we know it's fallen apart, but in 93 they both received the Nobel Peace Prize for their work there. But peace, when Jesus talks about it, is a much more comprehensive term. And I have little doubt that when Jesus talks about peace or being a peacemaker, that the word that he's working with is not the Greek word, because he didn't speak Greek. As a matter of fact, he probably didn't speak Hebrew in terms of his daily discourse, because at that time, most people, the normal language of the Jewish population was Aramaic. But in the Hebrew, the word that we translate peace is this great word shalom. And I know probably all of you are familiar with that, and it's simply a variation of that in the Aramaic shlama that probably is what Jesus spoke about here. But this kind of peace is much broader than our normal concept of kind of the end of hostilities or sort of, being in this tranquil state or whatever. This word, shalom, really was a word that spoke about a total state of well-being. It was a word that if you were experiencing this, the idea was that you would be experiencing the absolute best life possible. And in different contexts within the scriptures, the word can mean prosperity in a material sense. It can mean health in a physical sense. It carries this idea of fulfillment or satisfaction, harmony internally and with others, and also the idea of salvation, our relationship with God. And interestingly enough, because of the context we're looking at it in, there is a very close connection in the Old Testament particularly, but now Jesus is making it in the New, between peace, the shalom of God, and blessing, the blessing of God. And so we've looked at blessing, and we've looked at how Jesus, obviously, starting the Sermon on the Mount 9 times saying, blessed are, and how that there is this need in all of our lives to experience really the touch of God on our life that kind of touches us at the core of our being and blesses us. But the outcome then of blessing, or the product of blessing, is peace or shalom. Oftentimes when we have our benediction, and I know some of you have heard me speak on this before, but I'll oftentimes use the benediction out of the book of Numbers that God gave to the priesthood at Mount Sinai and told them how they were to pronounce a blessing upon the people of Israel. And it's where we get this benediction from. He says, that you are to say, or to say over the people, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his shalom, his peace. And then God says, in this way, the priests will put my name upon the people, and I'll bless them. So very interconnected, and I think, and I apologize, because in one of the commentators that I read, and this was probably not even recently, I had this definition of what is shalom, what is peace, and this is one definition. It's the quality of life and spirit which transcends any success which man alone, even under the best of circumstances, is able to attain. Now, this changes the concept of what a peacemaker is. And it's interesting that when you go back and look at the list of people that have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, oftentimes it's recognized that someone has really been a peacemaker that hasn't been involved in negotiating some sort of a diplomatic peace or whatever. And actually, probably one of the best illustrations of what a peacemaker looks like is Mother Teresa, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1976 for her work among the poorest of the poor, and really her model, I think, that she was to the rest of the world, and should be for us in terms of the love of Christ compelling us to go into situations of need and try and improve the quality of people's lives that are living in those kind of circumstances. And I think that that's intimately related to what Jesus is talking about here. That we live in a fallen world, that people live in broken relationship with God that has produced brokenness. Now, I'm going to give a third definition, because back when we talked about poverty of spirit and meekness, we talked about being broken. And the one definition of broken, of course, is this idea of being like a stallion getting domesticated. All right, that all of the power and wildness and strength of that horse is brought under the master's control, and we refer to that horse and say he's been broken. Now, there's another use of the word broken when we talk about people, where it's this sense of absolutely people just being crushed by the circumstances of life, and there's a brokenness there that is it's shattering, literally, in what it does to a person's life. And then there's a third use of it, which isn't quite as extreme, which simply means it doesn't work, right? I mean, something's broken. It's not working the way it's supposed to work, and we live in a world that's broken. It's broken spiritually, it's broken physically, it's broken economically, it's broken emotionally, it's broken relationally, and it is a world that is in desperate need of peace. And what Jesus came, part of why Jesus came, is he came to bring peace, shalom, into situations of brokenness, and he wants to use you and I as instruments of his peace. Let me give you just a little sketch of this in terms of what the scriptures teach, because I think it's one of these concepts or biblical truths that unless you're looking for it, you can kind of miss it. But for instance, prophetically, the coming of Messiah that is set forth in Isaiah chapter 9, and we hear this usually every Christmas time, that the Messiah, when he came, would be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, Shar Shalom in the Hebrew. And so prophetically, Messiah was going to be one that brought peace. At the moment of incarnation, on the night when the angels proclaim to the shepherds the birth of Jesus, what is it that they say? They say, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men on whom his favor rests." Now, I don't know what language they were speaking that in. I do know what language it was heard in, because the shepherds would have spoken Aramaic. So again, the idea here is what they heard was shalom, this again, life that only God can give on earth to men on whom his favor rests. And that's a grace concept there. So that from the moment of birth, the message is that in grace, something you don't deserve, God is going to bring peace. Then Jesus in ministry talks about this a lot. Chapter 14 of the Gospel of John, he says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you." And again, Jesus was saying this, it's recorded for us in Greek, but he was saying it in Aramaic. So again, this concept tying back. And then after Christ has gone to the cross, he's resurrected, he's ascended to the Father, and the apostles go out and begin to proclaim the message. Paul, for instance, in Ephesians says, "He himself is our peace." And then a little bit later in Colossians, when he's writing Colossians, or vice versa, he encourages the brothers there and sisters in Colossae to let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. And so from beginning to end, this is intimately interwoven into the message of the gospel and even church history, because the phrase that came to my mind as I was working on this week was again, even in the history of the church, one of the great examples of the peacemaker, St. Francis of Assisi. And the great prayer of St. Francis that begins, Lord, what? Make me an instrument of what? Your peace. So I think that kind of the first takeaway out of this is that we are called to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. Now, peacemaking, a little different than just peace itself. So if peace is shalom, what is peacemaking? And it's interesting because Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. And there's a sense in which that statement directly connects all the way back to what we referred to as the inciting incident in the whole big story, where God enters into covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And what does he say to Abraham? I will bless you, and you will be a blessing, and through you all nations on earth will be blessed. Now, the little phrase we played with back then is the idea that we are blessed to be a blessing. And it's almost exactly the same thing as saying we're blessed to be peacemakers. And yet we're to be grace dispensers. We're those that are to not only experience God's peace and blessing in our life, but to be dispensers of that peace. And so I would define a peacemaker this way, that a peacemaker is someone who actively and aggressively exercises his gifts, abilities, and resources to increase the quantity of shalom in the world. Peacemakers are world changers, all right? We change the world when in Christ we exercise whatever it is that God has given us and enter into some arena, and we'll talk about different arenas, but our objective in entering into those arenas is to improve the quality of a person's life. That we're there to increase shalom. Now, what does that look like? And as I thought about it, I thought what I would do is share with you a couple of illustrations out of our own body of people that when I think about this reality of being a shalom maker, people that are doing things that are really changing people's lives for the better, a couple of things came to mind. And the cool thing, honestly, about you guys is and don't be offended if I don't talk about you or what you're doing, because this room is full of people that are engaged in peacemaking kinds of efforts and ministries. And again, probably those of you from Highline background more familiar with these than those of you that are here from either CCC or just have started attending since we got here. But these are some great folks. And one of them I thought about was Morgan Johnson. You guys all know, a lot of you know Morgan, and this was before he got his hair cut. He's now got short hair, but Morgan is involved in a work called Come Let's Dance. And he is in Kampala, Uganda, working in the slums. Now, I can promise you that the slums of Uganda are a very graphic illustration of the brokenness of the world. People's lives, I mean, it's for many, it's a living hell. And Morgan works with this group that have gone into the slums of Kampala, and they've started orphanages, so they've brought kids out. This is some of the group that they work with, and They've started schools for these kids. They've gone in and have begun to train women in the slums in micro development, teaching them skills to make crafts that can then be sold to, again, elevate their quality of life. And it's very cool because it's all done, by the way, most of the work is done through local churches there in Kampala. And it's real low key in terms of the overt nature of what they're doing, but at the bottom, kind of the foundation of it is to express the love of Christ. And it's kind of fun, you probably can't see, but when I was looking at the picture, all of these little guys, and by the way, look at these kids, and then think about that before they got engaged with Come Let's Dance, these kids are living in slums where they're probably, if they're lucky, living in boxes in the slums and scourging for food among the scraps. And look at the faces. I mean, don't they just beam, you know? And in the background, you can't quite read it, but it's pretty cool because at one side is whatever the language of Uganda is, I'm not quite sure. Ugandanese or something? I don't know what it is, Peter, anyway. All right, anyway. But on the right is translated into English, and it's all about, love, and that love is a gift of the Spirit, and in the context of meeting their physical needs, they're meeting the deep needs of their life and introducing them to Christ. So Morgan is a peacemaker, and he's a world changer. Now, another one of my favorites is Melissa, and Melissa's probably here this morning, but Melissa Scott is the executive director of a ministry called the 1010 Project. And Melissa is great, and those of you that know her know this, but Melissa she's only trying to do one thing in the 1010 Project, and that is eliminate global poverty. That's all she's trying to do, all right? Eliminate global poverty. And in the same way that Morgan is working away there in Kampala, the 1010 Project is working in Kenya. And they're doing much of the same thing. They're feeding people, they're housing people, they're schooling people. It's just a great, and the 1010 comes, and I don't know, you probably can't see it. I don't think I have it on the airway. It comes from John 10:10. I've come that you might have life and might have it abundantly. And it's all being done in the name of Christ and in the Spirit of Christ. And there's this spiritual dimension, but really, and here's a kind of a cool picture of, again, the smiles and the faces on these kids that lives are being influenced. Now, Melissa is a peacemaker, and she's a world changer, but I wanted to also show you, because sometimes you look at some of these things and think, I could never do that. I could never do that. But here's Teresa Lasker, and Teresa is a peacemaker and a world changer. And what Teresa is, among other things, absolutely great at is cooking, and particularly desserts. She has a whole company where she makes desserts, and this is a picture last year from our Shop for a Cause that we did at the church, and we're going to do it here this year in a couple of months. And Teresa she made all of this and then sold it all, and all the money went to the 1010 Project. So you might think, oh, I could never do that. But see, there's a lot of things you can do to help what someone else is doing and have the same kind of an impact. Another one I love is Whiz Kids. And Sandy Elrod, who isn't here this morning because she's at another church recruiting tutors for Whiz Kids, but Sandy is involved, and this is a deal, and really done in the Spirit of Christ, done in churches with tutors that recruited from churches that are working with kids in our inner city and in Denver who really struggle with school and need help, and Whiz Kids goes in and tutors them, and the statistics and outcomes are great. And by the way, Sandy's daughter Casey, who's around here somewhere this morning, that's her in the middle, and she is a tutor. And so both Casey and Sandy are peacemakers. They're increasing the level of shalom in the world, and they're world changers. I was hoping you were here, Luis, because Luis is here sometimes, he isn't here sometimes. Luis is sitting down here. No, I saw Luis. Is Luis here? Maybe he isn't here this morning. Save Our Youth. Anyway, you're starting to get the idea. Save Our Youth. Here is a work in our city of mentoring. And so Save Our Youth matches, again, kids in the city, oftentimes that don't have one or the other of their parents, and provide mentoring for them, and the statistics in terms of how those kids go on graduate compared to kind of the general population and how many of them now are going on to college. It's a wonderful thing being done, again, in the name of Christ, and Luis is a peacemaker and is changing the world. And then I had to show you one more because this is my favorite peacemaker. And if she falls asleep, it's not because I'm boring, or it is, but Allison just got in at 9 last night from Romania. And anyway, and she was over there with a group called the Enlighten Foundation that she's working with, they're in 3 countries right now, and they targeted the most oppressed groups in these countries, and then their work is with women and children in those oppressed communities, because it's a tough life for many of them. And so they were in Romania working with the Romas, who are the gypsies. And the gypsies in Romania are a very oppressed minority. They actually were in Transylvania. And can you believe there's not a Harley dealer in Transylvania? I got no Transylvania Harley shirt out of this deal. I mean, it was, anyway, we might need to do that as a mission, anywhere. Anyway, but what Allison, and again, I know some of the story behind it, but many of these girls are married at the ages of 10, 12, 13. Allison said that in one room they were in with a group of these young ladies, that they all had babies, and they were all 14 and under, because in that culture, there's not hope to rise above that. And so Enlighten Foundation's gone in and they've started schools. They committed to a 15-year commitment to start a school for the young girls and to help also kind of impart hope to the moms. And it's just a cool thing. And they're in... So anyway, Allison was there, and this is another picture, and that's Nicole Kendrick, and Nicole is Chris Kendrick, our youth pastor's wife, and Nicole was there too. And again, out of very difficult situations, you just see these kids that, they're getting a chance. And the Enlighten Foundation's name comes from the verse in Ephesians where I pray that the eyes of your heart might be enlightened. And in the process of meeting these kind of physical needs, that the spiritual needs are addressed also of these people. And again, it's so cool. And Allison is a peacemaker and a world changer. And honestly, I think if you talk with Allie, she'd be the first to tell you that, we're pretty normal folks. We don't have any, excessive skills and abilities. We don't, we live a pretty, average kind of a life. And yet I've watched Allison have incredible impact, at least in 3 different efforts of peacemaking, simply because she heard the call of Christ and was obedient to it. And I do believe that all of us get a call in this area to be a peacemaker. And in this room today, I can tell you that there are at least 100, probably more, efforts at peacemaking that you are engaged in. We know this because we got the info, and that doesn't even count what the folks from CCC are doing, which I need to know about. I want to know more about what you're already engaged in, but you're all making a difference. And the incredible thing is that, it strikes me that oftentimes you hear people say that, critics will tell you that the problems in the world are caused by religion. And certainly religion has caused a lot of problems. Don't get me wrong. Christians are guilty of the Crusades. We're guilty of the Inquisition. terrorism has a religious, foundation to it, and religion can be immensely problematic, but frankly, wherever the gospel has gone throughout the world and throughout history, peacemaking has followed. And cultures and lives have been transformed. And, you look at the origin of orphanages. From the very get-go, they're taking care of widows and orphans right in the apostolic church, early chapters of Acts, and hospitals, schools, universities, global relief efforts. So many of these were launched in the spirit of Christ, a sense of call that people were being called out to make a difference and to be a peacemaker. Now, let me start wrapping this up. Peacemaking possibilities are unlimited, aren't they? I think where a lot of us hit the wall is that there is so much need in the world that it just seems overwhelming. And the danger of that, frankly, is to do nothing. So, what difference does it make if I do something? Because the needs are so overwhelming. No one can do everything. Everyone can do something. And my hunch is that if you're not engaged now in some sort of a effort, ministry, organization, or just your own heart reaching out, engaged in some kind of peacemaking, that this is something that Jesus wants in your life. He wants us all to be peacemakers. You can be a physical peacemaker. And if you're a physical peacemaker, you use your resources and your gifts and your abilities to meet physical needs in a fallen world. And certainly, along with the spiritual side, certainly 1010 Project, Come Let's Dance. Next week, you're going to hear about Lakota Outreach, which is a CCC-generated project where a group every year goes up to the Indian reservation. It's a shorter trip than going halfway around the world, but they're peacemakers, and they're dealing and trying to meet physical needs. Some of you are going to be called to be emotional peacemakers. Some of you already are emotional peacemakers, and you're going to use your resources and your gifts and your abilities to meet emotional and relational needs of hurting people. Some of you are professionals, I know, in the room. So, God calls you to perhaps a full-time role as a counselor, and you do it all the time. But others of you really are just probably going to be called to come alongside people in times of distress and need and be instruments of God's peace at an emotional level and dispensers of the love of Christ there, and emotional peacemakers. Some of you are going to be called to be spiritual peacemakers, to use your gifts and your resources and your abilities to meet the spiritual needs of people, to be, to help people come into relationship with Christ, to help people grow in their relationship with Christ, to come alongside and help those who are helping people with their spiritual lives. And I think about that. VBS is a peacemaking venture. Okay, we're reaching out and we're going to love on kids for a week, and many of those kids' lives will be changed because of what happens during VBS. And a lot of you are involved, and you're going to be out there, doing the stuff with the kids. But frankly, there's got to be somebody sitting behind doing the administration and some of that work. And it's why God gives us different gifts, because everything that He's placed within us has some relationship to what His call is going to be on our life. And you can be an instrument of peace at a spiritual level. And you have a way to be a peacemaker. The quotient of shalom in the world can be increased through your life. And that's, I think, the second takeaway is that I think God's saying to us all, make some shalom. Make some peace. Well, I'm going to finish, and I want to just finish telling you a little bit about the guy. And by the way, the payoff is this. You get blessed. At some point, we'll start putting the dots together here. Do you see how this works? Okay. you try and be a blessing, you try and be a peacemaker, and Jesus says you're going to be blessed. Now, that's what you're trying to accomplish in the life of someone else, and as you bless them, the reality is you get blessed. We all know this. None of us ever go out and do some of these kinds of projects without coming back and thinking, I don't know what happened to those guys, but I got blessed, for reaching out, being a part of that. And so the payoff is blessing, and Jesus said you'll be called sons of God. Well, I want to tell you just quickly, and I'm not going to give a spoiler, but again, come tonight. You will be inspired, I promise you. And again, to me, it sort of puts the finish on what I'm trying to teach this morning. But William Wilberforce was a peacemaker and a world changer. And in the movie, he is portrayed by a really handsome dude named Ioan Gruffudd, and he wasn't. From what we know, he was actually sort of a funny-looking little guy. Tremendously charismatic personality. He was tiny. I actually saw, when I was in England, I saw one of his, they had one of his outfits that he wore, and his chest was 33 inches around. He was I hate to tell you, that's like my waist is bigger than that, okay? Anyway, you probably have guessed that already. But anyway, he wasn't like a real handsome dude, but he was a pretty charismatic guy. But amazing life and an amazing story. He grew up relatively privileged. And again, I don't want to spoil this. I might just say a couple of things that aren't in the movie. But at an early age, actually lost his father and was sent to live with his aunt and uncle, who were part of a movement that was sweeping England at the time, and it was called evangelicalism. And that was a word used by its opponents to sort of demean it. And the great fear that happened was that his own mother and grandfather were afraid he was becoming a Methodist. Can you imagine becoming a Methodist? Anyway, and again, that was sort of a demeaning phrase originally, but he came under the influence of a preacher by the name of John Newton. Newton had been a slave trader, had come to a profound encounter with Christ, and became a great preacher, and wrote the song, by the way, Amazing Grace. Newton wrote the song, which is the tie-in. But Wilberforce kind of got away from his faith, and by the time he got to Cambridge, he really didn't believe anymore. And at Cambridge, he became great friends with another young student by the name of William Pitt. And leaving Cambridge at the age of 21, both Wilberforce and Pitt became members of Parliament in the UK. Well, it wasn't that time, it was just Great Britain or England. I don't know what they called it back then. Anyway, a lot of you guys are way behind schedule. 21 member of Parliament, just remember that. All right. Now, to make you feel even worse, Pitt, at the age of 23, becomes the Prime Minister of England. So you're all way behind on that one, I know. Okay, anyway. Through a series of incidents, which I, again, don't have time to go into this morning, but Wilberforce was challenged about his faith. And over a period of time, really wrestling through objections and reading the Bible and reading some other books, he came back to a deep commitment to Jesus Christ. He called it his great change. What you're going to see in the film a little bit is he really struggled because he sensed that God had a call on his life, but in his time, and it's not maybe uncommon in our time, if you were really committed to Christ, what did you do? You went into the ministry. So here he is, he's a member of Parliament, he's a politician, and he's thinking, I need to leave and, become a preacher. And he goes to William Pitt, who's his best friend, who doesn't really share his faith, and tells him he's getting ready to leave. And Pitt just tells him, don't do it. And actually a line from a letter written from Pitt to Wilberforce that you'll hear in the film tonight is that Pitt says to him, surely the principles of Christianity lead to action as well as meditation, and was encouraging him, you can serve God as a politician. And then he went to Newton and re-engaged with Newton, and here's his old pastor who certainly is going to tell him, yes, leave, go into the clergy. And Newton says to him, no, you should stay where you are because you can make a tremendous difference serving Christ right there. And so he stayed in Parliament. 2 years later, he wrote in his journal, and actually it was after another meeting with Newton, he called his conversion to Christ his great change, and then he wrote what he called his two great objects. And he simply wrote, God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. And in his day, that term meant the reformation of society. And Wilberforce began to be a peacemaker. In 1791, he put a bill on the floor of Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade, and it was defeated soundly. In 1792, he put a bill on the floor of Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade, and it was defeated soundly. In 1793, he put a bill on the floor of the British Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade, and it was defeated soundly. In 1797, he put a bill on the floor that would have passed, but his opponents gave out tickets to an opera, and you'll see this scene in the movie, and those that were going to vote for it went to the comic opera instead, and it was defeated, and he virtually had a nervous breakdown. It was kind of where the film starts. But every year, for 17 years, and sometimes more than once a year, William Wilberforce put a bill on the floor of the British Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade until finally, on February 23rd, 1807, Parliament passed that bill, and the slave trade was abolished throughout the entire British Empire, and millions of people's lives were changed because William Wilberforce was a peacemaker. Now, you might not do something of that scope. You might. God might surprise you. But I can promise you this. Every one of us in this room are called to be agents of God's shalom and to seek to minister in the world in His name, and let the level of shalom rise a little bit because of what we do, reaching out in the name of Christ to be peacemakers. Let's pray. Lord, there is certainly an interesting kind of progression here as we look at how you unfolded what you're trying to do in our lives. Lord, leading us away from self and into relationship with you, asking us and working in our lives that we would submit ourselves under your lordship and embrace meekness, stirring within us the desire, the hunger, and the thirst for righteousness that we would long to be your men and your women, changing our hearts, Lord, purifying them so that they aren't so consumed with our own issues, and begin to have a new compassion for the world in which we live that is so, so broken. And then calling us, Lord, calling us to extend ourselves, to reach out, to be engaged, to share your love, Christ, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to house the homeless, to visit the prisoners, as you say in Matthew. But all of these, and around us, Lord, so many people doing that. And we just pray I pray that we would pray like St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Hey, quietly, everybody's head bowed, take a minute, and would you just silently pray that right now? If your heart is stirred and you know, I want to get plugged in, would you just pray that? Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And Lord, I believe you'll answer that prayer in our lives. Thank you again for those that we just looked at this morning. Lord, for those working literally around the world. Lord, throughout every nation in the world where people call upon your name, Jesus. seeking to do exactly that. Thanks for this time we've had this morning, and Lord, I do pray that you would continue to teach us as we come back tonight to see amazing grace. In your name, amen.